The city of Verona at night was a quiet paradox, a place where shadows stretched long over cobblestone streets, and the gentle murmur of the Adige river whispered against the stone bridges, concealing secrets that only the night dared to reveal. Lanterns flickered along narrow alleyways, their golden glow barely touching the walls, leaving much of the city in soft, enveloping darkness. It was within this twilight world that Dario Santoro moved with a stillness that was almost unnatural, a figure known in hushed tones as the Night Cleaver. His name was carried through Verona's streets like a ghostly echo, an ominous whisper that suggested precision and danger, yet also evoked fascination. There was something hypnotic about him, a meticulous calm in the midst of a world teetering on the edge of chaos. Dario's presence was rarely announced. He did not rely on force or volume to command attention. Instead, he exuded a quiet authority that seemed to make the shadows themselves bend toward his will. People who glimpsed him described the sensation of a chill running down their spine, not from threat alone, but from the uncanny precision in the way he moved, the deliberate calmness in every gesture. He was a figure of contradiction, terrifying yet almost elegant, lethal yet composed. And in 1984, this calm precision was already beginning to form a reputation that would ripple far beyond the narrow alleys of Verona. Even in the city's most ordinary corners, cafes tucked under archways, small markets closing their shutters, or the faintly illuminated piazzas where elderly men played chess under dim streetlights, there was an awareness of him. Stories began to circulate slowly, quietly, as if carried on the river's soft current or whispered behind closed doors. He was not a man who sought recognition, but the very nature of his actions ensured it. Each carefully executed operation, each calculated move, left a mark that was felt more than seen, a signature left not in ink or blood, but in the psychological imprint of precision. The Night Cleaver was a surgeon of shadows, and his operating theater was the city itself, every street and corner a potential canvas for his craft. The calm of the night, the gentle hush of Verona's lanes, seemed almost tailor-made for someone like him. Dario had learned early on that terror was most effective when it came quietly, like the softest brush of a hand across a sleeping city. It was the anticipation, the unknown, that gripped people more than the act itself. He moved like a shadow that had learned the rhythm of the city, understanding the ebb and flow of nightly life, the occasional echo of footsteps, the faint creak of a shutter, the distant laughter of passers-by. Nothing escaped his notice. His mind catalogued everything, storing small details that might seem insignificant to an ordinary observer but were essential to his craft. By the time anyone realized he was near, it was too late, the moment had already passed, and the city returned to its calm, leaving only a lingering sense of unease. Yet, to understand Dario Santoro fully, one must see beyond the fear, beyond the legend whispered in darkened streets. There was a certain artistry in his method, a meticulousness that mirrored the work of a sculptor or a surgeon. Each move was deliberate, each decision calculated with a patience that could frustrate or mesmerize onlookers. It was this slow, deliberate approach that earned him the nickname, a title that was both a warning and a reluctant homage. Unlike the chaotic violence that often dominated criminal underworlds, his methods were precise and almost ritualistic, imbued with a discipline that suggested hours of study, practice, and a mind attuned to the smallest details. In a city that thrived on impulsive actions and loud displays of power, Dario's quiet mastery was both exceptional and unnerving. There was also a certain poetry to the way his legend spread. It was not in the brash headlines or dramatic confrontations but in the soft ripple of fear and respect that touched those who observed from the periphery. A shopkeeper locking his shutters a little earlier than usual, a taxi driver pausing a moment too long at a dim intersection, a passerby glancing nervously at the shadows, they all carried fragments of the story forward, unspoken, like a melody haunting the streets. And the more he remained unseen, the more the myth grew, for people tend to fear what they cannot touch, cannot see, cannot predict. Dario's mastery of the unseen made him more than a man, it made him an idea, a living embodiment of suspense and control within Verona's night. As the soft hum of the city continued, it became clear that the Night Cleaver was not merely a figure of violence. He represented a study in contrasts, a calm mind in a chaotic world, careful calculation in a city often ruled by impulsive decisions, invisibility in a place teeming with observation. His story was beginning to unfold in 1984, a year that would mark the beginning of a series of events that blended intellect, fear, and the quiet art of domination. Listeners, as they drift into the tale, are drawn into this rhythm, the gentle cadence of a city at night, the quiet tension of a predator whose work is both invisible and inescapable, and the hypnotic allure of a man who turns fear into a delicate instrument of control. Even as Dario's legend grew, there was a paradoxical serenity to his presence. The streets of Verona, dark yet alive with the faint glow of lamplight, mirrored the duality of his existence. He was both part of the city and apart from it, moving among the shadows with a discipline that seemed almost meditative. It was this duality, the combination of terror and tranquility, lethality and composure, that made him unforgettable, that invited both fascination and dread. And as the night stretched on, as the river whispered and the cobblestones glistened under the soft sheen of moonlight, the world seemed to hold its breath for him, the night Cleaver, whose story had only just begun. Verona in the 1960s and 1970s was a city of contrasts, a place where the elegance of ancient piazzas and Roman ruins coexisted with narrow, crowded streets where shadows gathered and whispered secrets. It was in this setting that Dario Santoro's early years unfolded, a childhood shaped as much by the quiet rhythms of ordinary life as by the subtle tensions that simmered in his surroundings. Born to a modest family, Dario's upbringing was not marked by wealth or privilege, but by the careful observation of the world around him. His parents, hardworking and unassuming, struggled to provide for their family, and the lessons he absorbed in these formative years were subtle yet enduring: patience, attention to detail, and the quiet power of knowing one's environment intimately. These lessons, though mundane on the surface, would later form the foundation of a mind capable of remarkable precision and chilling strategy. Even as a child, Dario displayed an unusual attentiveness to the movements and behaviors of those around him. While other children played in the sunlit piazzas or ran through narrow alleyways, Dario often lingered in the background, watching. He observed patterns in the way people walked, spoke, and reacted, cataloging these observations silently, as if storing them for a future purpose he did not yet fully understand. There was an early fascination with mechanics, with the way small actions could produce large consequences. A broken gate hinge, a misaligned shutter, or the quiet tremor of a neighbor's hand, all of these details registered with him, creating a mental map of cause and effect. To outsiders, he seemed introverted, almost withdrawn, but in reality, his mind was active, always calculating, always aware. It was in these quiet hours that the seeds of the night Cleaver began to take root, a discipline of observation that would later define his precision and strategic genius. The streets of Verona offered him a living classroom. He walked past bakeries closing for the evening, past markets filled with the scent of fresh bread and fruit, past cafes where men argued over politics or the results of local soccer matches. The city was alive with life, and Dario absorbed it all with a keen eye. He noticed how conversations ebbed and flowed, how the mood of a street could shift in an instant, and how small changes, a sudden glance, a paused step, a whispered warning, could alter outcomes. These observations were not simply curiosities, they were training for a mind that would later anticipate the movements of friends and foes alike with uncanny accuracy. Even as a boy, Dario understood the subtle interplay of environment, timing, and human behavior, lessons that would later make him nearly impossible to predict or trap. At home, Dario's upbringing was quieter, reflective, and imbued with small routines that emphasized discipline and attention to detail. Chores were performed with care, tasks were completed with precision, and mistakes were noted and corrected rather than ignored. His parents instilled in him a sense of responsibility, though they were unaware of the unusual intensity with which he absorbed the world. While other children might have seen daily routines as mundane, Dario approached them as exercises in control and observation. How a spoon balanced on the edge of a table, how a door creaked when opened too quickly, how a floorboard groaned under certain pressure, each detail became a fragment of understanding the predictability of the world. This quiet attentiveness would later translate into a terrifying mastery of timing and consequence, but in his childhood, it remained a curious habit, unnoticed by those around him. Despite his contemplative nature, Dario was not entirely isolated. He formed small bonds with peers, yet even in these relationships, he seemed to analyze rather than fully engage. Games were opportunities to observe strategy and decision-making, arguments and alliances among friends were lessons in loyalty, trust, and betrayal. He learned to detect subtle shifts in emotion, to read expressions and body language, and to anticipate reactions. These were early exercises in psychological precision, exercises that would become central to the way he operated in the shadows of Verona as the Night Cleaver. He was cultivating not just skills, but an understanding of human behavior itself, a tool more potent than any weapon. The city itself contributed to the shaping of his mind. Verona's ancient architecture created natural corridors and hidden spaces, shadowed alcoves, and quiet passages that invited exploration and observation. Dario wandered these streets with a curiosity that was part innocence, part meticulous reconnaissance. The interplay of light and shadow fascinated him, as did the quiet ways people navigated the night. Markets emptied and closed, shutters fell, and the city seemed to take a deep, rhythmic breath as evening deepened into night. It was in these moments, walking alone along narrow lanes, that he learned the subtle advantages of positioning, timing, and awareness, unknowingly rehearsing the skills that would define his later life. Every corner held a lesson, every flickering lamp an opportunity to observe, to calculate, to practice patience. As adolescence approached, Dario Santoro's quiet observations of Verona's streets and people began to take on a new dimension. The lessons of childhood, patience, attention to detail, subtlety, were no longer exercises in understanding alone, they became tools for action. He found himself drawn to the fringes of the city's underworld, not out of reckless curiosity, but with a careful, measured interest in learning the ways of those who operated in shadow. It began innocuously, with small errands for minor figures in the local criminal networks, delivering messages, observing routines, and understanding the dynamics of loyalty and fear. Each task was an opportunity to learn, each encounter a small piece of the puzzle that would later define his methodical approach to life in the shadows. Verona, with its narrow alleys, quiet piazzas, and hidden passageways, offered a perfect classroom for the young apprentice. These early interactions were not violent, they were observational, almost educational. Dario learned to recognize the subtle hierarchies within the city's criminal landscape, who commanded respect without words, who enforced loyalty through quiet intimidation, and who relied on impulsive displays of power. He watched patterns of behavior, noting how alliances formed and dissolved, how betrayal often came from those closest to the center, and how fear could be both a weapon and a weakness. It was a world of psychological complexity that demanded patience and intellect, qualities Dario had already been cultivating. Unlike his peers, who might have been drawn to the glamour of criminal exploits, Dario was fascinated by strategy, by understanding the invisible currents that governed outcomes long before anyone acted. The mentorship he received, though informal, was crucial. Older, seasoned figures in Verona's shadowed underworld recognized a keen intelligence in him, an ability to observe without being noticed, to analyze without alerting those around him. They provided guidance, often in the form of stories, warnings, and lessons embedded within seemingly trivial tasks. Each errand, each observation was framed as part of a larger picture, a way to cultivate both patience and understanding. Dario absorbed these lessons meticulously, mentally cataloging techniques, strategies, and mistakes alike. He learned that success in this world depended not on brute force alone, but on timing, perception, and the careful orchestration of every element in play. During this period, Dario also began experimenting quietly, testing his own instincts and observing the consequences of small actions. He noticed how people reacted to subtle threats, how hesitation could reveal intent, and how small gestures could command obedience or sow doubt. These experiments were conducted with precision and without excess, often leaving no trace of his involvement. Each successful observation, each unnoticed test, reinforced his understanding of the importance of remaining unseen, of allowing events to unfold according to his designs rather than through rash intervention. It was during these years that he began to develop the core principles of what would later become the Verona shadow technique: observation, patience, timing, and the careful orchestration of influence over direct confrontation. The streets themselves were silent teachers, offering lessons that could not be found in any formal instruction. Dario studied the rhythm of daily life, when shops closed, when guards changed, how the city breathed in cycles of light and shadow. He learned to move within these rhythms, blending into the environment, becoming almost imperceptible to those around him. Night walks through quiet piazzas, the gentle sound of river water lapping against the banks, the distant laughter of passers-by, all of these formed a mental map that he could navigate with precision. The city's subtle cues taught him not only about movement and concealment but about anticipation, predicting where people would be, what they might do, and how they could be influenced without direct interference. Every observation added another layer to the skill set that would later define him as one of the most calculated figures in Verona's underworld. It was during his early adulthood that the nickname, Night Cleaver, first began to attach itself to Dario Santoro, though the story of how it came to be remained cloaked in whispers, half-truths, and the exaggerations of those who observed him from afar. In the quiet of Verona's alleyways and the dim glow of lanterns, people began to notice a pattern in the acts carried out under the veil of night, a precision so meticulous, so surgical, that it seemed almost inhuman. His targets, when left intact, bore no more evidence than a shadowed presence, a subtle mark, or a whispered warning that the consequences of defiance were both swift and deliberate. The moniker was not one he sought, but it adhered nonetheless, a symbol of his growing reputation as someone who did not simply act, but orchestrated events with a calculated finesse that inspired fear and fascination in equal measure. The first operation that earned him the title was quiet, methodical, and executed with a calmness that left witnesses unsettled even as they struggled to comprehend what had occurred. He had been given a task by one of the city's minor factions, a test of observation, timing, and restraint. What unfolded was an act that combined anticipation, patience, and subtle execution, a maneuver so precise that it required more mental calculation than physical confrontation. Those who recounted it later spoke of a presence that seemed to glide rather than move, of shadows that shifted with intent, and of a quiet authority that commanded obedience without a word. The results of this operation rippled through Verona's underworld, planting the first seeds of a legend that would soon grow beyond comprehension. What made this early act so compelling was not merely its success but the almost imperceptible artistry with which it was conducted. Dario's approach contrasted sharply with the chaotic displays of aggression common in criminal circles. There was no shouting, no overt intimidation, no unnecessary violence. Instead, there was strategy, anticipation, and a level of control that suggested a mind several steps ahead of those around him. Every motion was deliberate, every decision measured, every reaction anticipated. In a world where impulsive action often led to failure, this quiet, calculated approach distinguished him immediately. It was as if the city itself paused in acknowledgement of his presence, the shadows bending subtly to accommodate a mind attuned to both timing and consequence. As word spread, whether through rumor, anecdote, or the subtle signs left in the aftermath of his work, the name, Night Cleaver, became shorthand for precision, fear, and the inexplicable ability to act without detection. People spoke in hushed tones, sometimes exaggerating, sometimes shrouding facts with fiction, yet the essence remained: Dario Santoro was no ordinary figure. His calm, almost meditative approach to operations created an aura that was both unsettling and magnetic. Those who encountered his work, whether as allies, rivals, or observers, began to realize that he possessed not just skill, but a unique psychology of control, an understanding of human behavior that allowed him to manipulate, predict, and dominate without overt force. It was this blend of intellect and quiet menace that cemented the nickname and laid the groundwork for a reputation that would grow to mythic proportions. The legend of the Night Cleaver was also fueled by the subtlety of his presence. Unlike many figures in Verona's underworld, Dario rarely sought recognition. There were no public displays of triumph, no reckless flaunting of power, no calls for acknowledgement. Instead, he operated in the background, allowing his work to speak for him. This invisibility only intensified the mystique surrounding him, as observers could not easily separate fact from fiction. Each successful act became a story whispered in cafes, alleyways, and markets, a story of a man who seemed to appear and disappear at will, whose timing was impeccable, and whose precision left even the most hardened criminals unsettled. The contrast between the calm of his actions and the fear they inspired created an almost hypnotic effect, drawing attention while maintaining an aura of untouchability. At the heart of this period was Dario's understanding of the psychological dimension of fear. He recognized that terror was most effective when subtle, when it lingered as a suggestion rather than a confrontation. His moniker was not just a description of his methods but a psychological instrument in itself. The name, Night Cleaver, evoked images of shadowed streets, silent movements, and the inevitability of consequence. It carried with it an implicit warning: precision and patience were far more dangerous than brute force. In cultivating this reputation, Dario not only protected himself from potential rivals but also began to shape the city's perception of him, turning legend into a strategic advantage that amplified the impact of his actions. Despite the growing reputation, Dario maintained a calm, almost meditative routine. His movements through Verona remained disciplined and deliberate, whether he was navigating crowded markets or empty alleyways. Each night, he observed, analyzed, and rehearsed in his mind the patterns of the city, the habits of people, and the possible outcomes of future actions. These routines were not mere preparation, they were an ongoing refinement of skill, an almost ritualistic practice that blended observation, patience, and strategic foresight. Every detail, from the timing of a street lamp flicker to the subtle shift of a guard stance, was catalogued and understood, contributing to a level of mastery that would soon set him apart from even the most seasoned figures in Verona's underworld. It was in these quiet, deliberate movements that Dario's duality became most apparent. He was at once a meticulous planner and an invisible operator, capable of reading the city and its inhabitants with uncanny accuracy. The calmness he projected, even in moments of tension, was part of his method, allowing him to maintain control over both his environment and the perceptions of those around him. This psychological sophistication, combined with his developing technical skill, created a figure who was not simply feared but respected, whose legend was as much about the mind as it was about action. By the end of this period, Dario Santoro had fully embraced the identity that the nickname, Night Cleaver, encapsulated: a master of shadow, precision, and unseen influence, a presence that loomed quietly over Verona, shaping events with subtle, almost imperceptible force. As Dario Santoro's reputation began to take shape, he started to develop a method that would later be recognized as the Verona Shadow Technique, a unique combination of observation, timing, psychological manipulation, and calculated precision. This technique was not the product of formal training or mentorship alone, but of years of quiet study and experimentation within the streets and alleys of Verona. Dario had learned that success in the shadows depended on far more than physical prowess. It required a complete understanding of environment, human behavior, and timing. Each element had to align perfectly, and he approached the creation of this method with a patience and discipline that would become his hallmark. The development of the technique began with observation. Dario spent countless hours walking the city at night, mapping patterns of movement, noting the routines of guards, merchants, and rival factions. He catalogued the minutiae of the city: the way a lantern flickered, the creak of a shuttered door, the rhythm of footsteps echoing against cobblestones. These details, trivial to most, became vital components of his strategy. By understanding the flow of the city, he could predict where people would be, how they would act, and how the environment itself could aid him in achieving his goals. Every movement was studied, rehearsed mentally, and refined. The city became both his classroom and his laboratory, a living network in which he could practice the interplay of action, timing, and consequence. Psychology was equally important to the technique. Dario understood that fear was most effective when subtle, when it existed as a suggestion rather than a direct threat. He observed how people reacted to uncertainty, to minor disruptions in routine, and to invisible presence. By manipulating perception, he could create tension and control outcomes without ever needing to confront directly. A glance from the shadows, a carefully placed object, or an unexpected pause in an alley could communicate a message far more powerfully than overt violence. Through these subtle manipulations, he learned to influence both allies and rivals, shaping behavior to suit his objectives while remaining largely unseen. This combination of psychological insight and environmental awareness became the cornerstone of the Verona shadow technique. Execution, however, required precision. Every operation, no matter how small, was meticulously planned and rehearsed mentally before being attempted. Dario would anticipate multiple outcomes, consider the positioning of each person involved, and calculate the optimal timing for every move. Mistakes were unacceptable, and he treated each task as both a rehearsal and a lesson. Early attempts were not always perfect, but each failure became an opportunity to refine the approach, to understand more deeply the intricate interplay between environment, human behavior, and timing. Over time, these careful experiments solidified into a systematic method that combined observation, manipulation, and execution into a seamless whole. The technique was not about chaos or aggression, it was about control, anticipation, and invisible influence. The artistry of the technique also lay in its adaptability. Dario understood that no two situations were ever identical and that rigidity would be his downfall. He trained himself to remain fluid, to adjust to changes in environment or behavior with minimal disruption. This adaptability extended beyond physical maneuvering to include psychological influence. He could shift his approach depending on the temperament, fears, and expectations of those he engaged with. This required patience, keen perception, and a deep understanding of human nature. By the time he reached his early 20s, the Verona shadow technique was not just a collection of tactics, it was a philosophy, a way of moving through the city and interacting with its inhabitants that maximized control while minimizing exposure. Another essential aspect of the technique was the concept of invisibility. Dario learned to make himself undetectable, not through brute stealth alone, but through anticipation and timing. He would often arrive at precise moments when his presence was least expected, executing actions with minimal disturbance to the environment. By controlling what others perceived, he could manipulate both fear and expectation. Even when observed, his movements appeared natural, blending seamlessly into the rhythms of the city. This skill allowed him to act with remarkable freedom, giving him an edge over rivals who relied on overt aggression or intimidation. Invisibility became a form of power, a way to dominate without ever being fully seen. The development of the Verona shadow technique also involved an understanding of patience and restraint. Dario learned that the most effective actions were often those that were delayed, those that waited for the perfect alignment of circumstances. Impulsivity could ruin careful planning, and he cultivated the ability to wait, to observe, and to allow events to unfold naturally before intervening. This discipline set him apart from peers and rivals, whose actions were often reactive and unpredictable. By contrast, Dario's methodical patience allowed him to control outcomes with a precision that seemed almost supernatural to those who encountered it. It was this combination of observation, psychological influence, timing, adaptability, and restraint that made the technique not only effective but legendary. Even as he refined the method, Dario remained quiet, almost meditative in his approach. Nights were spent walking the streets, reviewing mental maps, and rehearsing potential scenarios in his mind. Each shadow, each flickering light, and each distant sound was noted and incorporated into his understanding. He rarely spoke of his plans, trusting instead in the reliability of preparation and observation. This silence, coupled with the effectiveness of his actions, only heightened the mystique surrounding him. Stories began to circulate of a figure who could move through Verona unseen, manipulate events with precision, and leave rivals bewildered and fearful. The technique itself became a symbol of his intellect, patience, and mastery over both human behavior and the environment. By the time the technique was fully realized, Dario Santoro had transformed from a meticulous apprentice into a master of unseen influence. The Verona shadow technique was more than a set of skills, it was a way of life, a philosophy that guided his actions, informed his decisions, and shaped his reputation. It allowed him to navigate the dangerous networks of Verona's underworld with confidence, precision, and subtlety. Even the most seasoned criminals found themselves at a disadvantage when faced with his careful orchestration, for Dario's method was as much about perception and anticipation as it was about action. The city itself had become an extension of his mind, every alley and piazza a stage on which he could exercise control, silently and flawlessly. The refinement of the Verona shadow technique marked a turning point in Dario's life. It was no longer enough to simply observe or participate. He had developed a systematic approach that allowed him to predict, influence, and control outcomes in ways few others could. This method would become his signature, earning him both fear and respect, and laying the foundation for the legend of the Night Cleaver. It was a technique born of years of careful observation, quiet experimentation, and relentless refinement, a methodical mastery of shadows, timing, and human nature that would define his rise and ensure his place in Verona's hidden history. The first major operation that truly marked Dario Santoro's entry into Verona's criminal lore was executed with a level of precision that left both allies and rivals in quiet awe. Unlike impulsive acts of violence common in the city's underworld, this event was carefully orchestrated over weeks, with meticulous attention to timing, environment, and human behavior. Dario treated it as a test of both skill and patience, aware that any misstep could compromise not only his reputation but his very safety. The operation was to target a mid-level figure in a rival faction, a man whose influence was growing, whose recklessness threatened the delicate balance of power within the city. Yet for Dario, the mission was as much about demonstrating mastery as it was about eliminating a potential threat. Every detail, from the positioning of guards to the pattern of streetlights along the intended route, was carefully mapped and memorized. In the quiet of night, he walked the path repeatedly, rehearsing timing, angles, and contingencies, allowing the city's rhythms to guide his mental choreography. The night of the operation unfolded with almost hypnotic calm. Dario moved like a shadow, gliding through alleyways and blending seamlessly with the ambient hum of the city. He was acutely aware of every sound, every flicker of light, and every potential observer. The target, unaware of the precision that was closing in upon him, proceeded through his routine, a stark contrast to the meticulous orchestration happening in the surrounding shadows. As Dario approached, he relied not on brute force but on subtle manipulation and timing. A distraction here, a calculated pause there, guided both the target and his own movements with a precision that seemed preordained. Each step was measured, each decision deliberate, and the harmony between his observation and execution became the hallmark of what would later be known as the Verona shadow technique. By the time the mission concluded, there was no chaos, no dramatic confrontation, no bloodshed for the sake of spectacle. The rival's influence had been neutralized not through loud aggression but through subtle, undeniable demonstration of control. The impact was immediate yet quiet. Within the network, whispers spread of a figure capable of removing obstacles with surgical precision, a presence that seemed omnipresent yet invisible. Those who witnessed the aftermath described a city that had barely felt the action, yet understood the consequence. This operation, executed with calm efficiency, cemented Dario's growing reputation, laying the foundation for both fear and respect that would follow him through Verona's streets. What made this early success particularly significant was not merely its immediate result, but the way it showcased Dario's philosophy of control. He understood that fear, when carefully cultivated, could be more potent than force. The subtlety of his actions created uncertainty in his rivals' minds, a quiet tension that lingered long after the event itself. It was an early demonstration of the power of anticipation, psychological insight, and environmental mastery. Even those who might have opposed him were forced to reconsider the dynamics of influence and threat within the city. Dario's approach contrasted sharply with the reckless displays common in Verona at the time. His effectiveness lay in subtlety, patience, and strategic foresight, qualities that few could rival and even fewer could comprehend fully. The operation also served as a personal benchmark for Dario. He approached it not merely as a task but as a test of his method, his patience, and his ability to integrate observation, timing, and subtle influence into a single coherent strategy. Every phase was analyzed in advance, from the initial surveillance to the final execution, and each outcome was evaluated to refine future actions. The success was as much a confirmation of his growing expertise as it was a warning to those who underestimated him. Through this act, Dario demonstrated not only technical skill but also the mental discipline to remain calm under pressure, to anticipate reactions, and to execute plans with near absolute precision. It was a quiet mastery that left an indelible impression on all who witnessed it. In the aftermath, the city seemed to acknowledge his presence in subtle ways. Allies moved with a new awareness, rival factions paused in their routines, and even ordinary citizens sensed an unspoken tension in the night. The operation became a story whispered in cafes, alleyways, and markets, a tale of a man who could orchestrate events with invisible hands, leaving outcomes altered without leaving traces. This reputation, built on calm, deliberate action, allowed Dario to navigate the complex network of Verona's underworld with increasing freedom. His growing mastery of observation, manipulation, and execution became both shield and sword, allowing him to expand influence without overt confrontation. Despite the success, Dario remained methodical and reflective. He did not allow pride or ego to interfere with his planning. Each operation, even when successful, was an opportunity to refine his understanding of strategy, human behavior, and environmental dynamics. He meticulously catalogued every detail, from the timing of footsteps to the subtle cues in body language, ensuring that the next operation could be executed with even greater precision. This commitment to continuous improvement distinguished him from others in the underworld, who often relied on instinct or brute force. For Dario, mastery was a process, not a destination, and every mission was both a lesson and a demonstration of principle. By the end of this first major operation, Dario Santoro had fully demonstrated the power of the Verona shadow technique in practice. Observation, patience, subtle psychological influence, and precise execution coalesced into an approach that few could anticipate, let alone counter. The success not only cemented his reputation within the underworld but also set the stage for future operations that would expand his influence and solidify the legend of the Night Cleaver. Verona itself became both a playground and a stage, a city whose rhythms, shadows, and routines Dario could navigate with unmatched skill. In quiet moments, as the city exhaled its nocturnal calm, he reflected on each step, each decision, and each subtle manipulation, knowing that the mastery he sought required constant refinement, vigilance, and an unwavering commitment to precision. This operation marked the true beginning of his rise, a silent but undeniable entry into a world where intelligence, patience, and control outweighed noise, chaos, and brute force, establishing a foundation for a legacy that would echo through Verona's shadowed streets for years to come. By the time Dario Santoro had carried out his first major operation, his presence within Verona's shadowed networks had grown quietly but significantly. It was not merely his skill that drew attention, but the way he conducted himself, calm, deliberate, and unassuming, yet unmistakably capable. Those who recognized his potential, seasoned figures within the city's underworld, men who had seen countless aspirants rise and fall, began to approach him with subtle guidance. Mentorship came in the form of cautious observation, whispered advice, and the occasional opportunity to test his skills under close supervision. These older figures, some respected and feared, saw in Dario a rare combination, patience, intellect, and a psychological acuity that allowed him to navigate complex human dynamics without drawing unnecessary attention. They provided access to knowledge that was rarely written down, a mixture of strategy, caution, and the tacit understanding that only experience could offer. The alliances Dario formed during this period were both practical and strategic. He cultivated relationships with those who could provide information, protection, or insight, always careful to maintain distance and avoid emotional entanglement that could compromise his objectives. These connections were not friendships in the conventional sense, but rather networks of influence, each relationship measured for its utility, reliability, and potential risk. He observed the habits, tendencies, and loyalties of those around him, storing details mentally like pieces of a puzzle. This approach allowed him to anticipate reactions, predict behavior, and maintain control even in situations that might have overwhelmed others. The underworld of Verona was a web of shifting alliances and hidden agendas, and Dario moved within it with the calculated awareness of a chess player several moves ahead. Mentorship extended beyond tactical advice. Older figures in the network introduced him to the subtleties of human psychology as it applied to influence and control. They taught him to recognize hesitation, deception, and the cues that betrayed intention. These lessons were reinforced in practical exercises, observing interactions, participating in low-risk operations, and reflecting on the outcomes. Over time, Dario internalized these lessons, integrating them with his own observations and experiments. The result was a profound understanding of both human behavior and the intricate mechanics of influence, which became essential to his developing methodology. Each mentor offered a different perspective, yet all emphasized the same principle: control comes from knowledge, patience, and subtlety rather than overt force. As he navigated these relationships, Dario also learned the importance of discretion. He recognized that visibility was dangerous in a world governed by suspicion, envy, and ambition. By remaining calm, understated, and quietly effective, he gained the trust of mentors without drawing unnecessary attention from rivals. His reputation grew not through boastful displays or public spectacle, but through the consistent demonstration of skill and intelligence in small, precise actions. Each successful operation, each careful maneuver, reinforced the perception of a figure who could be relied upon to act without error, without fanfare, and without drawing unwanted scrutiny. In a city that often rewarded aggression and visibility, his quiet mastery became both shield and signature. The subtle balance of influence and observation also shaped his understanding of loyalty. Dario recognized that alliances were fragile, often contingent on mutual benefit, fear, or respect. He learned to cultivate trust selectively, to reward loyalty while remaining vigilant for signs of betrayal. These lessons were not abstract, they were observed daily in interactions among those around him, friends, rivals, and mentors alike. By studying these dynamics, he developed an instinct for reading situations, understanding motivations, and predicting shifts in allegiance. This skill allowed him to maintain his position within the network even as power structures shifted, and it became a defining characteristic of his approach to both personal and professional relationships. Even as mentorship and alliances provided structure and knowledge, Dario maintained a deliberate independence. He was careful not to become dependent on any single figure or faction, understanding that reliance could compromise both freedom and control. This independence allowed him to act decisively when opportunities arose, unencumbered by the obligations or expectations that might bind others. He could move between factions, observe patterns without interference, and position himself strategically for both immediate operations and long-term influence. In this way, his early alliances functioned as a scaffold, supporting his development while allowing him to maintain autonomy, a balance that would prove essential in the coming years. During this period, Dario also honed the social aspects of influence. He learned to communicate subtly, to convey messages through gestures, glances, and timing, rather than through words alone. These skills allowed him to coordinate with allies and mentors discreetly, to test loyalty, and to manipulate perception. In many ways, his social mastery was as important as his operational skill. By controlling how others perceived him, he could create advantages without confrontation, sow uncertainty among rivals, and reinforce trust among allies. Each interaction became a carefully considered exercise in both strategy and psychology, reinforcing the principles that would define his signature approach: observation, calculation, subtle influence, and patience. This period of alliances and mentorship also deepened Dario's understanding of the broader criminal ecosystem in Verona. He observed the interplay between minor factions and major players, the flow of resources, and the subtle negotiations that govern territory, influence, and power. These insights allowed him to anticipate opportunities and threats, positioning himself where he could act decisively with minimal exposure. By combining mentorship, observation, and careful relationship management, Dario began to emerge as a figure who was both respected and subtly feared. His actions were rarely flamboyant or violent for the sake of spectacle; instead, they were precise, calculated, and impactful, leaving a quiet but undeniable mark on the city's underworld. By the end of this formative period, Dario Santoro had fully internalized the lessons of his mentors and allies while developing a methodology uniquely his own. He had learned to navigate complex human networks, to predict behavior, to influence outcomes without overt confrontation, and to maintain discretion in all actions. These skills, combined with his observational mastery and psychological acuity, allowed him to operate effectively within the shadows, gaining both influence and autonomy. The careful cultivation of relationships, the selective application of loyalty, and the strategic integration of knowledge into action became central to his rise. In the quiet reflection of night, walking Verona's lantern-lit streets, he considered each lesson, each interaction, and each opportunity, recognizing that the web of mentorship and alliances was both a guide and a stage for his growing mastery, a mastery that would soon become legendary. In the dim corners of Verona's old quarter, stories often grow faster than truth can travel, and the legend of the Night Cleaver was no exception. What began as a single misunderstanding soon swelled into something vast, a tale repeated in alleys, whispered across cold stone bridges, and carried through taverns like drifting smoke. Dario Santoro, known by his allies for his restraint and precision, never once wielded the crude blade that would come to symbolize him. Yet the myth spread with the ease of a spark catching dry leaves, reshaping his identity in ways he neither intended nor controlled. It started on a winter night when a rival faction needed a ghost to blame, someone whose name already held an air of mystery. They planted a heavy butcher's cleaver beside a fallen enforcer. The handle was wrapped in dark cloth, and the steel glinted under street lamps as officers gathered. With no real evidence, whispers filled the void, pointing toward the quiet man who moved like a shadow. The cleaver became a metaphor, a symbol of violence far removed from Dario's careful methods. As rumors traveled deeper into the underworld, the weapon transformed from a prop into an emblem of supposed brutality. People began to imagine Dario carrying it on nocturnal errands, lifting it with cold detachment, leaving no trace behind but fear. None of this was true, yet truth rarely stood a chance once a story had momentum. Dario heard the whispers long before he understood how far they had spread. At first, he dismissed them as idle talk, knowing the criminal world thrived on exaggeration. But the stories tightened around him like a net, altering conversations, shifting the glances that followed him through markets and meetings. Men who once spoke to him with quiet respect now watched his hands, as though expecting sudden harm. The irony was sharp. The man famous for avoiding bloodshed became renowned for a blade he had never touched. Even allies found advantage in letting the myth grow. A reputation built on fear required no demonstrations, no raised voice, no display of force. Opponents hesitated, negotiations smoothed, and conflicts dissolved before they began. Still, the myth carried an unease that Dario could not shake. He had always valued precision, control, and the subtlety of influence, but now his name evoked chaos he neither embraced nor admired. Sometimes, late at night, he walked the quiet banks of the Adige River, listening to the water glide beneath arched bridges. Lantern light shimmered on the surface, rippling like fragments of distorted truth. In those silent moments, Dario wondered how a man could lose ownership of his own story so quickly. The planted cleaver had become more than an object, it was an idea, a phantom presence shaping his interactions. Rivals avoided direct confrontation, relying instead on speculation to gauge his intentions. Some believed he used the cleaver as a calling card, others whispered that he crafted his own weapons with surgical detail. The absurdity might have amused him if not for the consequences. For in the underworld, myths were not harmless, they were tools, armor, or traps. And this one was slowly guiding him toward a future he had not chosen. Yet Dario adapted, as he always did. Rather than fight the story, he allowed it to drift, neither confirming nor denying it. The myth became a cloak, shielding him from reckless adversaries while granting him time to maneuver quietly behind the scenes. Even so, he carried a quiet awareness that one day the legend might demand proof he was unwilling to give. And as winter deepened over Verona, the cleaver's shadow stretched longer, folding itself into every conversation, every rumor, every cautious step taken after dark. It was a silent companion, unwanted, but impossible to escape. Though he tried to ignore it, the myth soon influenced decisions made far above his reach. In distant cities, men who had never heard Dario's voice spoke of him as if he were a specter carved from night itself. A broker in Milan warned associates that Santoro could slip through locked doors, like fog with a blade. A smuggler in Genoa claimed his cousin once saw Dario cleanly sever a rope from 10 paces away. Each retelling added a new impossible detail until the truth dissolved entirely. Dario realized then that myths did not spread, they multiplied. He watched as younger recruits in the Verona network began studying him with a mixture of awe and dread. They mimicked his silence, misread his calm, and repeated the stories as if reciting scripture. A few even carried small cleavers tucked into their belts, believing it aligned them with his legend. The sight unsettled him deeply, for it showed how quickly influence could distort into something hollow. He had never wanted disciples, much less imitators who misunderstood everything about his craft. One evening, Dario sat alone in a dim trattoria near the city walls. Outside, rain traced delicate patterns down the windows. Inside, the low hum of conversation blended with the clink of glasses. As he sipped a quiet espresso, he overheard 2 men at the next table discussing him. They spoke of the Cleaver in reverent tones, imagining the fear it struck into enemies. Their words drifted through the room like smoke. Dario felt a strange mix of detachment and sorrow, as though they were speaking of a stranger wearing his face. Yet there was no reversing a narrative once it had spread this far. Myths, he understood, were like tides, steady, relentless, and indifferent to the stones they reshaped. The Cleaver story would follow him now, no matter how far he walked or how gently he lived. The only choice left was how to move within its shadow. So Dario rose from his table, stepped back into the rain-soaked street, and allowed the night to swallow him once more, silent, thoughtful, and aware that the legend trailing him was both a burden and a shield. He breathed slowly, accepting the weight of stories around him. In the years when Verona's criminal world strained under the pull of colliding ambitions, the northern syndicates found themselves teetering on the edge of chaos. Scattered factions, each guarding its pride as fiercely as its territory, prepared for confrontations that would have reshaped the region with blood. Yet amid this swelling tension, something unexpected began to form, a quiet, almost invisible consolidation guided not by brutality but by the steady influence of Dario Santoro. Though many saw him only as a shadow passing between meetings, those who paid closer attention understood that his presence calmed storms before they ever truly gathered. He was not a commander, not a don, not even a man who openly sought leadership. But in an underworld where reckless tempers could ignite entire neighborhoods, his restraint became a rare force capable of binding rivals together. It began with murmurs about a dispute between 2 families who controlled key routes stretching from Verona toward the industrial outskirts of Brescia. Their arguments, rooted in years of unresolved grudges, had begun to spill into the streets. Most believed open war was inevitable. But Dario, observing from the periphery, understood that both factions stood to lose more than either wished to admit. One evening, beneath the low arches of a shuttered wine cellar, he persuaded representatives from each side to consider what their conflict would cost, the financial drain, the risk of police intervention, and the inevitable fracture of alliances they depended on. He spoke quietly, without dramatics, yet something in the clarity of his reasoning softened the edges of their anger. They left without shaking hands, but they left without drawing weapons, and that alone signaled the beginning of change. Over the following weeks, Dario positioned himself as a mediator without ever claiming the title. He corrected misunderstandings before they deepened, ensured obligations were met on time, and discreetly redirected grievances away from violence. His methods were subtle, a conversation with a courier here, a message carried between capos there, each move precise as if part of a larger, deliberate pattern. Men who had once dismissed him began seeking his insight, finding in him a stability they lacked. Even the myth of the Night Cleaver, though false, gave weight to his suggestions. No one wished to provoke a man whose reputation hinted at a hidden edge. Yet his true power came not from fear but from perception. Dario observed details others overlooked, the tremor in a rival's voice, the impatience of a lieutenant hungry for recognition, the unease of a capo who worried about losing influence. With these fragments, he shaped a broader understanding of the entire northern landscape. He saw the alliances that could form, the compromises that would hold, and the individuals whose pride threatened the fragile balance. Slowly, almost imperceptibly, the scattered pieces began to align. The turning point arrived when a rising faction from the western lake sought to seize a smuggling route threading through the outskirts of Verona. Their ambition threatened to unravel months of progress. Instead of encouraging retaliation, Dario approached the faction's lieutenant in a discreet nighttime meeting held in an abandoned farmhouse. Frost coated the fields, and the air was sharp with winter stillness. There, he laid out the consequences of their expansion, not as a threat but as a simple truth. He then presented a solution: shared access, regulated by clear agreements, monitored through neutral channels. The lieutenant, wary of risking a confrontation with a man shrouded in such enigmatic influence, accepted the offer. What might have become a regional conflict dissolved into uneasy cooperation. From that moment forward, syndicates across northern Italy began adjusting their operations around Dario's recommendations. It was not formal power, he issued no commands. Instead, his presence acted like a gravitational force pulling scattered entities into a delicate orbit. Leaders compared notes, realizing they had all spoken with him recently, each leaving their meeting with a sense of cautious optimism. The result was a stabilization no one had anticipated. Profits grew steadier, territorial disputes waned, and for the first time in years, the region operated under a semblance of order. Still, the peace he shaped was fragile, and Dario sensed its limitations. He often stood on the balcony of an old apartment overlooking Verona's narrow, lantern-lit streets, knowing the calm below depended on the restraint of men who were not naturally patient. Some resented the quiet authority he exerted, believing he manipulated their futures for his own benefit. Others feared that his mythic reputation masked intentions they could not decipher. Dario understood that influence, even when benevolent, invited suspicion. Yet despite the brewing uncertainties, he took a moment to absorb the stillness of the city he had protected from swallowing itself. Verona, ancient and worn yet quietly beautiful, slept more peacefully than it had in years. And for Dario, that was enough, for now. He knew storms were forming beyond the hills, carried by men who disliked the idea of someone shaping the underworld's direction without their permission. He could feel the tension building like distant thunder, though its arrival had not yet been announced. For the moment, however, northern Italy rested under a fragile harmony he had stitched together through patience, precision, and the unspoken understanding that wars avoided were victories in themselves. And as he looked out over the sleeping city, Dario Santoro knew that when the next challenge emerged, he would face it with the same quiet resolve that allowed him to steer Verona away from the brink, one thoughtful step at a time. It was during a cold spring evening in Verona that the first real tremor of miscalculation entered Dario Santoro's otherwise meticulously measured world. For years, he had navigated the underworld with quiet precision, letting patience and observation guide his decisions. Yet even the most careful men can falter when a single choice intersects with the ambitions and misperceptions of others, and on that night, Dario's judgment, subtle and deliberate though it was, would set in motion a chain of consequences he had not fully foreseen. The incident began with a young courier, a boy no older than 19, entrusted with delivering a sealed envelope to a distant contact in Milan. Dario had advised discretion, emphasizing the importance of remaining unseen, avoiding attention from rival factions and local authorities alike. The courier, eager to prove himself, deviated from the instructions, taking a route that passed too close to a factional checkpoint. The encounter was brief and bloodless, but it planted seeds of doubt among those watching from the shadows. A single misstep, a minor lapse in the flow of information, became the fulcrum upon which suspicion would pivot. When Dario first learned of the deviation, he assessed it with calm detachment, noting the courier's inexperience and lack of malice. In his mind, it was a solvable problem, a simple correction in technique. But the underworld functions on perception as much as on fact. Word of the misstep reached the ears of senior operatives who interpreted it differently. Whispers began to circulate: had Dario truly lost control of his network, or worse, was he deliberately exposing assets to test loyalty? The ambiguity, small and almost imperceptible at first, widened into a chasm. He found himself caught in a subtle web of assumptions, each thread taut with tension, each glance and word charged with unspoken judgment. Dario recognized the danger immediately. In Verona, power is often measured not by action but by the ability to maintain equilibrium. A single lapse can invite challenge, and once that challenge appears, it can expand, unchecked, like a stain spreading over parchment. The challenge he faced, however, was more insidious than open confrontation. There were no raised voices, no drawn weapons, only a quiet recalibration of alliances, a recalculation of trust among men who had previously deferred to him without question. It was a delicate shift, imperceptible to outsiders, yet seismic within the confines of his network. To mitigate the unfolding consequences, Dario relied on the one asset he had always wielded with unwavering certainty: observation. He began mapping the subtle movements of those around him, noting patterns of behavior that might indicate suspicion or disloyalty. Meetings once conducted in casual ease now required layered strategy. A comment about a missed payment could be interpreted as critique, a delay in communication might hint at betrayal. Each detail, however minor, demanded attention. Dario moved like a surgeon through these intricacies, excising doubt where possible, reinforcing confidence where necessary. His approach was methodical, almost ritualistic, combining direct intervention with the subtle manipulation of perception, and yet, despite these efforts, the consequences of a simple misstep continued to echo. The next critical moment occurred during a late-night assembly of Verona's mid-tier operators. The atmosphere was tense, the air charged with unsaid concerns. Men who had once regarded Dario with unquestioned respect now eyed him with a careful neutrality. Questions were framed indirectly, suggestions tested the boundaries of his patience. Every response he gave was measured, deliberate, designed to convey competence without revealing vulnerability. Yet, beneath the calm exterior, Dario understood that trust, once shaken, could not be fully restored in a single evening. The miscalculation had left its mark, and he would need to rebuild confidence through a series of precise maneuvers, each reinforcing the narrative of his reliability. Meanwhile, external factors compounded the internal unease. Rival factions, always attentive to shifts in Verona's underworld, detected the subtle faltering. Although they had long respected Dario's strategic acumen, rumors of hesitation and misjudgment spread quietly through the channels of information. Observers interpreted his rare interventions as reactionary rather than calculated. The result was an increase in scrutiny, a tightening of expectations. Men who previously deferred to his judgment began testing him, probing the limits of his influence. Dario faced a paradox: act too decisively, and he might appear overbearing; act too passively, and he risked losing control entirely. The misstep of a single courier had thus become the lens through which his competence was evaluated across the city's complex network of power. In response, Dario adopted a dual strategy of containment and foresight. He personally oversaw critical deliveries, meticulously reviewing routes and contingencies, while simultaneously orchestrating the perception that the network remained seamless and under his command. Small acts, carefully timed, demonstrated both authority and calm, reminding allies and rivals alike of the precision that had earned him the moniker Night Cleaver. In private moments, he reflected on the irony: a life built on foresight and caution could be destabilized by an act so minor, so unremarkable, and yet in the realm of human perception, minor events often carry disproportionate weight. As the weeks passed, the initial tremor of miscalculation began to settle, though it left lasting effects. Relationships were recalibrated, allegiances quietly renegotiated, and suspicions slowly diffused through repeated demonstrations of competence. Dario, however, remained vigilant, aware that the underworld rarely forgives hesitation, and even the most controlled response leaves traces. He redoubled his attention to detail, reviewing past actions, analyzing potential points of vulnerability, and reinforcing the structural integrity of his network. The experience, while unnerving, strengthened his appreciation for the delicate balance required to maintain influence in a volatile environment. It served as a reminder that control is never absolute and that even the most carefully planned life can be disrupted by forces beyond immediate perception. By the end of that season, Dario had restored both his network and his reputation, though he carried with him a deeper understanding of the fragility inherent in his position. The miscalculation of a single courier had tested not only his operational skills but his emotional resilience and strategic patience. It underscored the truth that influence in the underworld is as much a matter of perception as it is of action. In the quiet hours of the night, walking the lantern-lit streets of Verona, he contemplated the lessons learned. Trust is both vital and ephemeral, vigilance is eternal, and even the most subtle errors can ripple outward with consequences that only careful observation and measured response can contain. From that point forward, Dario approached every decision with a heightened awareness of potential misinterpretation, blending calm analysis with anticipatory planning. And in this way, the miscalculation, though initially threatening, became an instructive moment, a silent teacher guiding him toward even greater mastery of the shadows he navigated with unparalleled precision. The night in Venice carried a weight that Verona's streets had never demanded. Dario Santoro moved silently among the fog-laden canals, his presence barely registering to the waterborne city, yet every step echoed the tension coiling around him. He had come not to announce himself but to observe, to listen, and to measure the quiet shifts in a network that was beginning to fracture. The alliance he had carefully nurtured over the preceding years was now under strain, and betrayal, subtle and deliberate, was threading its way into conversations that Dario could only overhear through intermediaries. It was not the overt violence that marked danger, but the quiet reorientation of loyalties, the whispered doubts, the sidelong glances, the minor favors withheld. In Venice, these subtleties were amplified by the city's reflective waters and labyrinthine passages, each alley and canal acting as a mirror to human motives, duplicating half-truths and rumor into full-blown perception. The fracture began with a meeting of operatives, ostensibly convened to discuss the logistics of smuggling routes connecting Venice with northern Verona. Dario attended, though carefully, from a distance, allowing the interactions to unfold before he intervened. The usual deference to his counsel had dissipated, men who had long accepted his strategic insight now tested it with calculated skepticism. Words were chosen with care, each phrase a probe, each suggestion a subtle challenge. The undercurrent was unmistakable, someone had decided to cast doubt on his judgment, and the ripple was spreading faster than he anticipated. As he noted the interactions, he realized that the fracture was not merely local but systemic. One faction's impatience had seeded mistrust among others, and the network's cohesion, fragile by design, now trembled under the weight of suspicion. Dario's first task was to identify the source of this subtle betrayal. Unlike the abrupt treachery he had faced in Verona during his early years, this was measured and deliberate, executed by someone who understood the strategic advantage of quiet destabilization. A careful observation of body language revealed a lie as plainly as any spoken word might have. A hand resting too long on the table, a glance toward a rival rather than the speaker, the avoidance of customary acknowledgement, these were the signals he recorded in a mental ledger, each one a clue to the shifting alliances that threatened to undermine his influence. Venice, with its reflective surfaces and muted nighttime sounds, magnified these signals, allowing him to perceive them with a clarity that the bustling streets of Verona had never permitted. The city itself became an accomplice in observation, reflecting duplicity and tension back to him in mirrored canals and shadowed bridges. The challenge, however, lay not in identifying the betrayer but in counteracting the fracture without provoking further disruption. Dario could not rely on direct confrontation, that would draw attention to his vulnerabilities, inviting deeper challenges. Instead, he orchestrated a series of subtle interventions designed to redirect focus, restore balance, and reassert his influence quietly. Messages were relayed through trusted intermediaries, each carefully phrased to correct misperceptions without revealing his hand. Minor favors were granted, calculated acts of goodwill that realigned obligations and reminded those involved of their mutual dependence. By acting indirectly, he preserved the integrity of the network while simultaneously asserting his continued presence in its oversight. The personal element was never absent. Dario understood that influence in this world depended not solely on logic but on perception, and perception is intimately tied to emotion. He began meeting individually with key operatives under the guise of casual conversation, listening more than speaking, allowing them to reveal their doubts and fears. In each exchange, he offered guidance without prescription, illustrating the consequences of misaligned action through hypothetical scenarios rather than mandates. By framing these discussions around observation and consequence rather than authority, he reinforced respect for his insight while avoiding the appearance of coercion. Trust, once shaken, cannot be forced back into place, but it can be gently nudged toward stability through careful, patient engagement. As nights stretched into weeks, the network's subtle tension gradually eased, though the process demanded constant vigilance. Dario spent hours in quiet reflection, mapping interactions and alliances in his mind with the precision of a surgeon. Each decision was considered not in isolation but in relation to the larger ecosystem of factions, rivalries, and ambitions that composed Venice's underworld. Every small adjustment, redirecting a shipment, adjusting a payment, confirming a route, acted like a stitch in a fragile fabric, holding together threads that threatened to unravel. And yet, he never allowed his actions to appear deliberate, maintaining the illusion that outcomes were natural rather than engineered. The genius of his approach lay in this subtlety. Men believed the restored equilibrium was the result of chance, not the careful orchestration of a man who observed more than he acted. Despite his measured success, Dario remained aware that stability was temporary and fragile. Venice, with its unpredictable tides and shifting waters, mirrored the volatility of the alliances he sought to preserve. One misstep, one misinterpreted gesture, could reignite tension and undo months of careful work. It was this understanding that made him cautious, reflective, and ever watchful, yet it was also what allowed him to anticipate the moves of those around him. He acted like water flowing through canals, adjusting to obstacles, redirecting pressure, and ensuring that movement continued even when the surface appeared calm. The Night Cleaver's reputation, though rooted in myth, provided an additional layer of influence. Men hesitated before challenging someone whose name had become synonymous with efficiency, discretion, and subtle power. The culmination of this period of fractured tension arrived during a meeting at a secluded palazzo overlooking the Grand Canal. The room was dimly lit, the air thick with the scent of aged wood and polished stone. Key operatives gathered, each carrying their own reservations and ambitions. Dario, present but unobtrusive, allowed discussions to unfold naturally. Disagreements surfaced, old grudges threatened to erupt, yet he intervened only where necessary, guiding the conversation with questions rather than statements, framing choices without dictating them. By the end of the evening, agreements were re-established, commitments reaffirmed, and the subtle fracture that had threatened the network's cohesion was largely healed. No one outside the room could have discerned the delicate maneuvers that had restored balance. To the world, the alliances appeared unbroken, seamless, and entirely natural. As dawn approached, Dario left the palazzo and walked along the quiet canals. The fog clung to the water, and the gentle lapping against gondolas mirrored the rhythm of his thoughts. He understood that the restored trust was provisional, maintained only through continued observation and subtle intervention. Yet there was satisfaction in knowing that a fracture, once threatening, had been contained without violence, without overt display, and without exposing weakness. The lesson was clear: influence, carefully exercised and patiently maintained, could achieve results far beyond the reach of force. Venice slept around him, unaware of the tension that had almost undone the delicate balance of its hidden networks. And in the silence of the early morning, Dario Santoro moved through the shadows, a man both present and unseen, navigating betrayal with the precision and calm that had always defined him. The pressure that had been building in northern Italy finally came to a head when Dario Santoro found himself standing at the edge of a precipice, one where even his deft hands could not predict the outcome. It was a hot summer evening when the call came through, a simple message delivered with a tone that hinted at the gravity of what lay ahead. The message was direct: the syndicate needed a decision, and it needed it now. A high-stakes meeting had been arranged, and Dario understood that this time, the game was different. The usual subtleties would no longer suffice. No quiet negotiations, no calming words, this was to be a battle for control, one where a misstep could unravel everything he had built. The city's streets, already simmering under the summer heat, felt thick with anticipation, as if even the buildings themselves could sense the impending clash. Dario's mind raced as he reviewed the situation. For years, he had maintained a delicate equilibrium, balancing factions, rivalries, and ambitions with a precision that was unmatched. But in recent months, the alliances had begun to fray. A coalition of younger, bolder operators had started to question his approach, challenging his methods, pushing for more aggressive action. They believed the network needed to expand its influence more quickly, take more risks, and demonstrate force to solidify its power. They saw Dario's restraint as weakness, his caution as an inability to act decisively. To them, his quiet approach lacked the fire and energy needed to seize greater opportunities. What they didn't understand, what they couldn't yet comprehend, was that Dario's power lay not in brute force but in his ability to see the long game. The dynamics he had carefully cultivated were built on patience, trust, and an understanding of the delicate balance of power that held Verona's underworld together. But the world was changing, and so were the men who operated within it. The younger generation, hungry for wealth and glory, believed the old ways were outdated. They were impatient, reckless, and ready to challenge the established order. And now, they had made their move. Dario entered the room where the meeting was set to take place, the air thick with the scent of cigars and freshly poured whiskey. The faces around the table were tense, all eyes trained on him as he took his seat. These were the men who had once deferred to his judgment, now questioning it, their eyes sharp with suspicion. At the far end of the room sat the leader of the faction that had been pushing for a more aggressive strategy. His name was Marco Venti, a rising star in the syndicate, known for his charm and ambition. He had built a following among the younger operatives, and it was clear that he believed this was his moment to step into the leadership role. Dario studied Marco with a calmness that betrayed no hint of the pressure he felt. Marco was a good strategist, no doubt, but his impulsiveness and lack of long-term vision were glaring weaknesses. Dario knew that. Still, he had to respect Marco's ability to rally support and his willingness to challenge the status quo. But what Marco lacked was a deep understanding of the price of power, how it can consume you if you're not careful. Dario had spent his life learning that price, understanding it from every angle, and now he was preparing to show Marco why patience, precision, and discipline were worth more than blind ambition. The meeting began with pleasantries, but the tension in the room was palpable. Marco wasted no time getting to the point. "It's time for us to expand, Dario," he said, his voice brimming with confidence. "We've been playing it safe for far too long. The city is ripe for the taking, and the syndicate is losing ground. We need to be bolder. We need to assert our dominance before someone else does. The time for subtlety is over." Dario's expression remained unreadable. He had heard these arguments before, from men like Marco who thought power was won by brute force, by intimidation, by taking what wasn't offered. But that approach, he knew, was short-sighted. The lasting power came from control, from understanding the ebb and flow of influence, not from reckless actions that could alienate allies and invite retaliation. "Marco," Dario began, his voice low and deliberate, "power isn't about taking risks for the sake of it. It's about understanding when and how to strike. We've been patient because patience has brought us stability. If we start making moves without considering the consequences, we risk everything. We risk not just our own future but the future of every man in this room." Marco's eyes narrowed, a flicker of irritation crossing his face. "You're too cautious, Dario. The world is changing. These old ways you speak of, they're becoming irrelevant. We need to act before we're left behind." Dario could feel the weight of the moment pressing on him. This was no longer a discussion, it was a challenge. A challenge to his leadership, to his vision. And yet, as he listened to Marco's impassioned speech, Dario realized that his calmness, his control, was what set him apart. He didn't need to raise his voice or slam his fist on the table. He didn't need to show aggression to assert dominance. The days following that pivotal meeting were a blur of tension and quiet anticipation. Dario Santoro walked the streets of Verona with a new weight upon his shoulders, an invisible burden that had settled somewhere between his ribs. He had won the battle within the room, but he knew that the real war had just begun. His reputation, once solid and unquestioned, was now under scrutiny. Marco's challenge had rattled the foundation of his leadership, and even if his voice had prevailed in that moment, the younger operatives were not the type to be easily silenced. In the underworld, power was as fragile as it was potent, and the more a man struggled to retain it, the more it seemed to slip through his fingers. Dario found himself navigating a landscape that was shifting beneath his feet. The network, which had once followed his every word, now carried whispers of dissatisfaction, of doubt, of impatience. It was subtle at first, a change in the tone of conversations, a shift in the way his directives were received. The younger men, Marco's supporters, had grown restless. They were eager to move forward, eager to take the risks Dario had long avoided. And though they respected him, there was a growing sense that they no longer feared him. That fear, once the cornerstone of his power, had started to wane, replaced by a quiet skepticism that spread like a virus through the ranks. In the dim light of his office, Dario sat alone, his fingers tracing the rim of a glass that had long since emptied. The room was silent except for the faint hum of the city outside, the muffled sound of life continuing without regard to the delicate war he waged within these walls. His mind was a maze of calculations, the weight of each decision pressing down on him. He thought about Marco, about the fire in his eyes, the challenge in his voice. He had been right to resist the younger man's push for aggression, but the fact that Marco had even dared to question him was a sign of something larger, a shift in the winds, a coming change that Dario could not ignore. The problem, Dario realized, was not Marco's ambition, it was the growing divide between old and new, between caution and boldness, between tradition and revolution. It was a divide that could no longer be bridged by words alone. The men around him, the ones who had once been loyal to him, were beginning to wonder if he had become obsolete. The world was changing rapidly, new players were entering the scene, and the old guard was struggling to keep up. Dario had spent his life carefully building an empire based on subtlety, on controlling the unseen, but in a world that was becoming more brazen and unpredictable, that strategy was starting to lose its edge. Dario knew that change was inevitable. The question was whether he would adapt with it, or whether he would cling to the old ways until they crumbled beneath him. The longer he hesitated, the more power would slip out of his grasp, slipping into the hands of men like Marco, whose recklessness would one day lead them to ruin. Dario's survival, and the survival of the network he had spent decades building, depended on his ability to find a new balance between the old and the new, between control and chaos. But how? He had been the master of subtlety for so long, the king of the shadows. He had never been the type to lead with his fists or his words, preferring instead to move behind the scenes, manipulating events from the periphery. But the times were changing. His network, his allies, his enemies, they were all becoming more overt, more brazen. The quiet strength he had relied on was no longer enough. If he was to remain relevant, to maintain his position at the head of the syndicate, he would need to evolve, to adapt to the new world that was rising around him. And so, Dario began to make plans, not just to maintain control, but to reassert his dominance in a way that would reintroduce fear, the kind of fear that had once made him untouchable. It would not be through brute force, not yet. That would come later, when the time was right. For now, Dario's plan was to re-establish his influence through a series of well-placed moves that would remind everyone, Marco and his supporters included, that Dario was still the master of Verona's underworld. The first step was to tighten his relationships with the more established members of the syndicate, those who still respected his leadership and his long-term vision. They were loyal, but even they had begun to question whether Dario could weather the storm of younger, more ambitious men. Dario knew that without their support, he would have no chance of regaining control. He arranged private meetings with them, one by one, subtly reinforcing the value of his strategies, the importance of patience, of long-term planning. He reminded them of all they had achieved under his guidance, all they stood to lose if they allowed the network to be swept away by youthful zeal. At the same time, he began to address the growing unrest among the younger operatives. He understood that Marco's challenge was not just about ambition, it was about the perception of weakness. To them, Dario seemed indecisive, outdated, unwilling to take the risks necessary to expand their influence. Dario knew that to undermine Marco's position, he needed to show them that he was still capable of decisive action. He needed to make them fear him again, not through violence, but through strategic brilliance that would leave them in awe of his vision. Dario's first move was subtle, a whisper here, a well-timed message there. He began to circulate rumors that the city's biggest rival syndicate, the one that had been slowly encroaching on their territory, was planning a major move. It was a calculated gamble. If the younger men believed the threat was real, they would demand action, and Dario would have the opportunity to step in, showing them that he was the one who could protect them from external forces. But Dario's true plan was more layered than that. He wanted to create a sense of urgency, a sense that the old ways were still relevant, that he still controlled the most critical pieces of the game. The rumors spread quickly, as intended. Marco and his followers, eager to prove themselves, began pushing for an immediate response, an aggressive strike against the rival syndicate. They were hungry for action, for validation, for power. But Dario, ever the tactician, waited. He let them push, let them talk, let the pressure build, until it reached a breaking point. Then, when it seemed like they were ready to act impulsively, Dario stepped forward, not with a bold declaration, but with a calm, measured response that was as disarming as it was decisive. Patience, Dario said quietly to Marco, is the most dangerous weapon in this game. We will wait. And when the time comes, we will strike, but only when it will hurt the most. It was a quiet victory, but a victory nonetheless. Marco, frustrated and impatient, had no choice but to fall in line for now. And as the days passed, Dario's influence slowly began to resurface, subtle yet undeniable. He had not only regained control of the narrative, but he had also reminded everyone that his calm, strategic brilliance could not be easily replaced. The weeks that followed were marked by a quiet tension, the kind that hangs in the air just before a storm. Dario Santoro's calculated strategy of subtlety had begun to take root, but the landscape of Verona's underworld was far from stable. Though his immediate position had been secured, the simmering unrest beneath the surface was palpable. The younger men, eager for change, were still disillusioned with his methods, even if they had been forced to wait for the moment to strike. They whispered among themselves, wondering how long it would be before Dario's caution led to stagnation. They were waiting, biding their time, for the first sign of weakness to pounce upon. Dario, ever the strategist, could feel the weight of their stares even when they weren't watching him. His ability to maintain control through subtle gestures and whispers had been tested, but the cracks in the facade were beginning to show. He had not yet moved against Marco's faction directly, but the pressure to do so was mounting. Every moment he delayed, every decision to take the safer route rather than the bolder one, was another crack in the foundation of his authority. But Dario was no fool. He understood the dynamics at play. Power wasn't about reacting to every provocation, it was about timing, about choosing the right moment to make a move. And that moment was coming. The rival syndicate that had once been a distant threat now loomed ever closer, a shadow on the horizon. The tension between Dario's old guard approach and the newer, more volatile tactics was becoming increasingly unmanageable. Something had to give. The first real test of Dario's patience, and his ability to maintain control, came when an unexpected event shattered the delicate balance he had fought so hard to maintain. A betrayal, the kind that could only come from within. Word reached Dario late one evening, carried on the wind like a bad omen. One of his most trusted men, a capo named Stefano, had been seen meeting with representatives from the rival syndicate. The whispers had already begun, growing louder by the hour, Stefano had been secretly negotiating with the enemy, offering them inside information in exchange for power. The news hit Dario like a slap to the face. Stefano had been with him for years, one of the few men Dario had trusted implicitly. The loyalty of his inner circle was what had kept his network strong, and to see that loyalty betrayed was both a personal and professional blow. But Dario, ever composed, knew that emotion had no place in these matters. Betrayal had always been a part of the game, and while it stung, it was not unexpected. What mattered now was how he responded. Dario called an emergency meeting with his most trusted lieutenants. The room was heavy with tension as he took his place at the head of the table, his face an impassive mask. He had already made up his mind about what needed to be done, but he would allow the others to speak first. His lieutenants, some seasoned veterans and others still eager to prove themselves, spoke nervously of the implications of Stefano's actions. They discussed the risks of making a move against him now, the potential for backlash, and whether it would be wise to let him go or eliminate him entirely. Dario listened, his mind working through the possibilities, his fingers tapping rhythmically on the table. The key to maintaining control was not in the immediate retribution, but in the message that would be sent. If he let Stefano go without consequence, it would show weakness. If he reacted impulsively, it would alienate his remaining allies, especially those who had once been close to Stefano. He needed to send a message, loud and clear, that loyalty was non-negotiable, but he also needed to do it in a way that did not fracture the fragile unity that still held his network together. "I've made my decision," Dario said at last, his voice calm, unwavering. "Stefano's actions cannot be forgiven. But we will not move hastily. We will give him one last opportunity to prove his loyalty. We'll make him think he has a way out, and when he believes he's safe, that's when we strike." The room fell silent as Dario's lieutenants absorbed his words. The days following Stefano's death were thick with tension, but the storm that had been threatening for so long never quite arrived. The network, for all its whispers and rumors, remained eerily still. The message had been sent, and Dario could feel the ripples of it vibrating through the ranks. Betrayal had been met with swift retribution, and the absence of Stefano, once a trusted lieutenant, was a stark reminder to everyone that loyalty in Dario's world was a non-negotiable commodity. In the aftermath of Stefano's execution, Dario found himself at a crossroads. The younger faction, led by Marco, had been watching closely, and he knew that their patience was wearing thin. They had been forced to submit to his strategy, to the patient, almost lethargic way in which he handled the network. But Dario knew they would not remain passive forever. Marco's ambitions were growing by the day, and his thirst for power would soon demand a reckoning. The calm waters of Verona's underworld were deceptively placid, and beneath the surface, a current was building. Dario's thoughts turned inward. The old world, the one in which he had operated with such careful precision, steering everything from the shadows, was fading. The new generation of criminals, emboldened by new technologies and the shifting political climate, had no patience for the subtlety that had made Dario who he was. They wanted more. They wanted power, and they wanted it now. It was the same impatience that had driven Marco to challenge him in the first place. For the first time in years, Dario found himself questioning his own methods. He had built his empire on a foundation of whispers, subtle maneuvering, and an iron will. But the landscape was changing, and perhaps his empire was no longer suited to the times. A new era was dawning, one in which speed, aggression, and audacity were the keys to survival. Dario knew that if he didn't adapt, if he didn't evolve, he would be left behind, a relic of a bygone age. But Dario was no fool. He had seen how quickly the tides could turn. Marco's brashness, his willingness to take risks, could just as easily lead him to ruin. The new world might be hungry for power, but power without control was a dangerous thing. It was a lesson Dario had learned the hard way, and he knew it was one Marco had yet to grasp. The thought of Marco's rise to power weighed heavily on Dario's mind. The younger man had a fire, an ambition that was undeniable. But Dario had always been the more patient of the two. He understood the delicate balance of power, the way that control was often about waiting for the right moment to strike. He wasn't concerned with taking the easy route or making hasty decisions. His empire had been built over decades, and he was willing to wait another decade, if necessary, to see it through. But Marco was different. Marco wanted it all now. And it was that hunger, that impatience, that would be his undoing. Dario's thoughts were interrupted when a trusted associate, Giovanni, entered his office with a grim expression. Giovanni, a man who had been by Dario's side for years, was not one to look so worried unless something serious was afoot. He closed the door quietly behind him and took a seat across from Dario. "There's trouble," Giovanni said simply, his voice low. "The new blood, they're making moves." Dario's brow furrowed. He had been anticipating this, but hearing the news brought an undeniable weight to the moment. He leaned forward slightly, his eyes narrowing. "What kind of moves?" he asked, his voice a sharp contrast to the calm facade he had maintained all these years. Giovanni hesitated for a moment before speaking. "They're pushing harder into our territory. They've made contact with several of our suppliers, and there's talk that Marco is trying to make alliances with the rival syndicate." The news hit Dario like a punch to the gut, but he masked it quickly, his face remaining stoic. Marco was making a bold move, aligning with the very syndicate that had been eyeing Verona for months. It was a dangerous gambit, one that could unravel everything Dario had worked for if it succeeded. And the fact that Marco was willing to play such a high-risk game spoke to the desperation that had begun to take root in his heart. "I need to see them," Dario said after a moment, his voice steady. "Both Marco and the rival syndicate. We'll handle this ourselves." Giovanni nodded and rose to leave, but Dario stopped him with a hand. "And Giovanni, make sure to keep an eye on Marco. I don't want him thinking he has the upper hand." "Not yet." The meeting with Marco was set for the following evening. Dario, though outwardly calm, felt a sense of urgency that he had not experienced in years. The time for subtlety was running out. Marco had taken the first step toward an open war, and Dario would have to meet him head-on. The question was not whether Dario could win, it was whether he was willing to sacrifice everything he had built in order to do so. As the sun began to set on Verona, Dario found himself standing on the balcony of his villa, looking out over the city. The streets below were bathed in the soft, golden light of the evening, but Dario could feel the impending storm in his bones. The room was thick with an unspoken challenge as Dario faced Marco, their eyes locked in an unyielding stare. Marco, ever the bold one, stood at the center, his posture full of youthful arrogance, as though he had already claimed victory in a battle that had yet to begin. The flickering candlelight cast sharp shadows across their faces, heightening the tension that hummed in the air. Marco's eyes glinted with that same insatiable hunger for power, but Dario remained calm, his expression unreadable. Dario had always believed in the power of patience, the kind that bided its time like a serpent waiting for the perfect moment to strike. And this moment, standing face to face with Marco, was no exception. He had always known that this day would come, the day when the ambitious youth would challenge him. What he hadn't anticipated was how reckless Marco had become in his pursuit of control, how eager he was to cast aside the careful strategies that had built Dario's empire in favor of sheer brute force. Marco was blinded by his own drive for power, but that would be his undoing. Dario took a step forward, his presence commanding the room as he spoke. "You've been busy, Marco," he said, his voice low and steady. "Making deals with enemies, undermining the network, but all for what? To sit in the chair of a king without knowing what it truly means to rule." Marco's grin faltered for a split second, his confidence shaken. "You're living in the past, Dario," Marco shot back, his voice tinged with impatience. "The world is changing, and you're stuck in your old ways. You've grown weak, complacent. You've had your time, but now it's mine." Dario couldn't help but notice the fire in Marco's words, the way he spoke with such conviction, as though he had already won the war without fully understanding the consequences of his actions. There was no longer any subtlety in Marco's approach. He wasn't playing the game with the finesse that Dario had mastered over the years, he was charging ahead, thinking that brute force and alliances with the rival syndicates would bring him the throne. But power, Dario knew, was far more intricate than that. It wasn't simply about muscle or numbers, it was about control, strategy, and understanding the human element of fear, loyalty, and respect. Dario didn't respond immediately. Instead, he took a slow, deliberate step toward Marco, closing the distance between them. He could feel the younger man's pulse quicken, the air charged with anticipation. Marco might have been bold, but Dario was always in control. His silence, his measured movements, his ability to command attention without uttering a word, these were the tools that had made him untouchable for so long. "I see you've aligned yourself with some powerful people," Dario said, his voice soft but carrying a sharp edge. "But tell me, Marco, do you really think they'll have your back when the time comes? When the true test arrives, will they be standing beside you, or will they be the first to throw you to the wolves?" Marco's expression darkened, and for the first time, Dario saw a flicker of doubt cross his face. The alliances Marco had so eagerly sought out might have seemed strong, but Dario knew better. In the world they inhabited, alliances were fragile, easily broken when the right amount of pressure was applied. There were no real loyalties in this game, only power and the ever-present threat of betrayal. "You think I don't know how this world works?" Marco spat. "I've learned from the best. I'm not a fool, Dario. I'm smarter than you give me credit for." Dario couldn't help but smile, though it was a thin, cold smile. "You're not a fool, Marco," he said quietly. "But you're impatient. You're hungry for power without understanding what it means to truly hold it. You've seen the top of the mountain, but you've never learned how to climb it." Marco's anger flared, but Dario's calmness seemed to penetrate it, slowing his heart rate, forcing him to think more carefully than he wanted to. The truth was, Dario had always been the master of patience, of understanding the long game, while Marco was rushing to seize everything before he had the foundation to support it. The younger man's ambition was blinding him to the risks, to the dangers that lay ahead. And Dario knew, without a doubt, that Marco's hunger for control would eventually lead to his downfall. "You've made your move, Marco," Dario continued, his voice barely above a whisper, but it seemed to echo in the room. "But this is not a game. You cannot just charge into this world thinking that force will carry you through. It doesn't work like that. The moment you show weakness, the moment you let your guard down, they will turn on you. They always do. And then, when you're no longer useful, they'll cast you aside." The room fell silent, the only sound the distant hum of the city below. Marco's expression had shifted again, this time to one of unease, though he fought to keep his composure. Dario's words had found their mark, sinking into the cracks of Marco's overconfidence. The younger man was beginning to realize that his desire for power was not enough to guarantee success. He needed more. He needed the understanding that came with years of experience, the wisdom that only time could provide. And Marco was running out of time. "You think I'm afraid of that?" Marco asked, his voice shaking slightly, though he quickly recovered. "I don't care about your rules, Dario. I'm going to take what's mine, and no one is going to stop me." Dario's gaze softened, and for a brief moment, it seemed as though he pitied Marco. The younger man was too blinded by ambition to see what was right in front of him, the truth of the game they played. It wasn't about taking what was owed to you. It wasn't about making alliances with anyone who promised you power. It was about understanding the flow of the underworld, knowing when to strike, when to retreat, and when to let others think they were in control, all while pulling the strings from the shadows. "You may think you have the upper hand now," Dario said, his voice smooth, like velvet. "But the moment you start acting like you've already won, that's when you've lost." Marco's jaw clenched, but he remained silent. The uncertainty that had begun to creep into his heart was now palpable. For all his bravado, for all his ambition, Marco knew deep down that Dario was right. He had made a fatal mistake, he had rushed into a war without understanding the terrain. And Dario had already positioned himself in the perfect place to strike when the time was right. The tension in the room reached a boiling point. Marco's eyes were filled with defiance, his youthful arrogance slowly giving way to an uncomfortable realization that Dario's words were sinking in. The air was thick with the unspoken understanding that something had shifted, a change in the dynamic between them. For all his bravado, Marco could not escape the feeling that he was walking into a storm he wasn't prepared for. Dario, however, was calm, his demeanor as steady as ever. He knew the power of patience, the strength that came with waiting, watching, and understanding the shifting tides of the underworld. Marco's impatience, his hunger for control, had made him vulnerable. And Dario was prepared to exploit that vulnerability in the most methodical, yet decisive, way possible. For a long moment, neither man spoke. The silence stretched between them, heavy and uncomfortable, but Dario knew it was necessary. It was a quiet power play, a demonstration of who truly held the reins of this fragile kingdom they both sought to control. Marco shifted his weight, his eyes darting toward the door, as though considering whether to end the meeting there and walk away. But he stayed. Deep down, he knew that Dario had the upper hand, and to leave now would be an admission of defeat. "Why do you keep dragging this out, Marco?" Dario finally asked, breaking the silence with a tone that was almost too soft. His eyes never left Marco's, studying every flicker of emotion that passed across his face. "You've made your move. You've started this war, and yet you still don't understand the nature of it. You think that because you've made a few deals, because you've threatened a few people, that you've earned your place at the top. But you're wrong." Marco clenched his fists at his sides, but Dario could see that the fire in his eyes was beginning to dim. He was still defiant, still unwilling to admit that Dario might be right, but the doubt was there now, a crack in his confidence. "You don't get it," Marco said, his voice trembling slightly. "I don't need to wait anymore. I'm done being patient. This is my time." Dario's lips curved into a small, almost imperceptible smile. "It's always your time, isn't it, Marco?" he replied, his voice tinged with both mockery and a deep, underlying sadness. "But you don't see the cost. You don't see what happens when you rush into the fire without knowing how to control it." Marco's face reddened, but Dario wasn't done. The younger man was still too full of arrogance, still too convinced that his drive and ambition would carry him through. But ambition alone was not enough. Ambition could only take you so far, and in the world they lived in, where betrayal lurked around every corner, it was often those who were too eager to seize power who paid the highest price. "Power is a game of patience," Dario continued, his voice low and steady. "And you, Marco, are playing it like a child who's too eager to win. You've been too hasty. Your moves are too visible. And that will be your downfall. I've seen it before. I've watched men like you rise, only to fall because they didn't understand that power isn't just about force, it's about control. It's about knowing when to make your move and when to wait." Marco's face was a mask of frustration now. He didn't want to hear this. He didn't want to accept that his quick rise, his daring moves, might not be enough to sustain him. But the seed of doubt had been planted, and it was starting to take root in his mind. He shifted uncomfortably in his seat, his eyes darting around the room as if searching for an escape from the uncomfortable truth that Dario was laying bare before him. "You're just afraid, Dario," Marco finally spat, the words leaving his mouth with venom. "Afraid of change. Afraid of losing control. That's all this is. You've built an empire on silence and shadows, but it's time for something different. I'm not afraid to take risks. I'm not afraid to fight for what I want." Dario's gaze never wavered. He wasn't angry, wasn't defensive. He didn't need to be. Marco's words were empty. Dario knew the truth, and he knew that Marco was still too green to understand the full weight of what he was stepping into. "You think I'm afraid?" Dario asked quietly, his voice almost a whisper. Marco, I've already fought every fight there is to fight. I've seen men with more ambition than you, with more power than you, fall before me. I've lived through wars that would have broken you in half. I don't need to fight anymore. I've already won. The words hung in the air like a heavy fog, and for a moment, Marco seemed to shrink, his shoulders slumping ever so slightly. Dario's confidence was unshakable, his sense of authority absolute. It was a truth Marco couldn't escape, no matter how hard he tried to convince himself that he was ready to take Dario's place. You've had your empire, Marco said finally, his voice quieter now. But it's over, Dario. The world is changing. The old ways are dead. The new generation doesn't care about your rules. They don't care about your patience. They want results, they want action, and they want it now. Dario's eyes softened, and for a brief moment, he almost felt pity for Marco. The younger man's vision was clouded, distorted by his ambition and his need to prove himself. He thought he understood the world they inhabited, but he didn't. The underworld wasn't a place for those who rushed in without understanding the consequences. It wasn't a place for those who thought they could control everything with sheer force and speed. The world doesn't change just because you want it to, Marco, Dario said, his tone gentle but firm. It changes when you understand it. When you know how to bend it to your will. And right now, you don't understand anything. You're playing at something you're not ready for. For a long moment, the room was still. Marco didn't reply, his gaze lowered to the floor, his mind clearly racing as he grappled with the weight of Dario's words. It was a truth he hadn't wanted to hear, a truth that was beginning to sink in, piece by piece. The silence was broken by the faint sound of footsteps approaching, distant at first, but growing closer. It was a reminder that in this world, there was always more at play than what was immediately visible. Marco had challenged Dario, but in doing so, he had invited a reckoning that he might not be prepared for. I think, Dario said softly, you'll learn. But it might be too late. The silence stretched between them like a taut wire, vibrating with the weight of unspoken truths. Marco was struggling now, the confidence that had once burned so brightly in his chest flickering like a candle in the wind. He had always believed that power was something to be seized, something to be grasped with both hands and held tightly, no matter the cost. But Dario had shown him something he hadn't fully understood before: power wasn't something you could force into your grasp. It was something you had to earn, something that was given, not taken. Dario stood there, watching Marco, his calm presence like a force of nature. He knew this moment was inevitable. Marco had always been a force of will, a young man driven by an insatiable hunger for control. But the thing about hunger was that it could consume you. It could blind you to the realities around you, to the fact that sometimes, the key to survival wasn't pushing harder, it was knowing when to step back, when to let the storm pass, and when to strike with precision. Do you really think they'll follow you? Dario asked, his voice low, but carrying a weight that cut through the tension in the room. Marco flinched, his eyes narrowing as he tried to maintain some semblance of defiance, but it was clear that the younger man was beginning to crack under the pressure. He hadn't been prepared for this, hadn't been prepared to face the depth of Dario's experience, the quiet power that radiated from him like an impenetrable fortress. Marco opened his mouth to speak, but the words didn't come. Instead, he glanced at the door, as though weighing his options. There was a part of him that still wanted to walk away, still wanted to escape the conversation, the pressure that was mounting with every passing second. But he couldn't. He knew that if he left now, it would be a surrender. It would be an admission that Dario was right, and that thought was too painful for him to accept. His pride, his ambition, everything he had fought for, was on the line. I've got alliances, Marco said finally, his voice quieter than before, but still laced with a hint of anger. You think they won't back me? You think they won't help me take over when the time comes? You're wrong, Dario. I've already secured my position. Dario smiled, a small, almost imperceptible smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. Secured your position? You think that just because you've made a few deals with the right people, you've secured anything? He shook his head slowly. Marco, the moment you show weakness, the moment they see that you're not the man they thought you were, they'll turn on you. And they won't hesitate. They'll cut you down faster than you can blink. Marco's jaw clenched. He had heard Dario's warnings before, but hearing them now, so calmly spoken, was unsettling. Dario had been in this world long enough to know how it worked. He knew the people Marco had aligned himself with, the ones who had promised power, who had promised loyalty. But loyalty was a fragile thing in the underworld. It was a currency that was spent quickly, and once it was gone, there was nothing left but the cold, hard reality of betrayal. I don't need them, Marco said, his voice gaining strength, but there was a quiver in it that betrayed his uncertainty. I don't need anyone to follow me. I'll make them follow me. I'll force them to. Dario shook his head slowly, his eyes never leaving Marco's face. You don't understand, do you? He murmured, almost to himself. You think you can force people to do your bidding, but that's not how this works. People follow strength, Marco. They follow conviction. But that doesn't mean they'll follow someone who doesn't understand what it takes to lead. And right now, you don't understand what it takes. For a long moment, Marco stood there, his fists clenched at his sides, his chest rising and falling with the weight of his anger and frustration. He had been so certain of himself, so sure that he could take what was his. But now, with Dario's words lingering in the air, he wasn't so sure anymore. The truth was, he didn't fully understand the game he was playing. He didn't understand the cost of every decision, the consequences of every move he made. He was still a child in a world of monsters, trying to hold his ground without realizing just how fragile his position really was. I've been playing this game for a long time, Marco, Dario said, his voice suddenly softer, almost reflective. Longer than you've been alive. I've seen men like you come and go. I've watched them rise and fall, thinking that they could outsmart the system. But it's not about outsmarting the system. It's about understanding it. It's about knowing when to fight, when to retreat, and when to wait. Marco took a step back, his eyes narrowing as he processed Dario's words. For a moment it was as though a veil had been lifted, and he could see the truth in Dario's eyes. The realization hit him hard, like a punch to the gut. He had been so focused on the end goal, the power, the control, that he hadn't stopped to think about the deeper implications of what he was doing. He hadn't understood the gravity of the world he was trying to dominate. The underworld wasn't a place for reckless ambition. It was a place for patience, for cunning, for wisdom that could only be gained through years of experience. And Marco didn't have that. For the first time, he began to question his path. Was it too late to turn back? Was there a way to avoid the downfall that seemed inevitable, or had he already passed the point of no return? Dario seemed to sense the shift in Marco's demeanor, the internal battle that was now raging in the younger man's mind. He took a slow step forward, his voice low but firm. You've made your choices, Marco. But the path you're on doesn't lead to power, it leads to destruction. You're going to find that out the hard way, and when you do, there won't be anyone left to pick up the pieces. Marco's gaze faltered, and for the first time, Dario saw the cracks in his armor. The bravado, the defiance, they were slipping away, piece by piece. The realization was settling in, slowly but surely. Marco had been living in a dream where he was untouchable, where his ambition was enough to carry him to the top. But Dario had shattered that illusion, showing him the ugly truth of the game they played. I don't know if you'll make it out of this alive, Marco, Dario said softly, his voice almost pitying now. But I do know one thing, you're not ready. Not yet. Marco's mind raced as he stood in the quiet room, the weight of Dario's words pressing down on him like a suffocating fog. His breath came in shallow gasps, and for the first time in his life, he felt truly uncertain. For all the bluster, all the bravado, he was now confronted with the brutal reality of the world he had stepped into. He had always believed that power was something to be fought for, something to be seized, but Dario had shown him that power was also something to be earned. It was a game of patience, of subtlety, of knowing when to move and when to wait. And Marco had never been good at waiting. He glanced around the room, his eyes flicking nervously to the door, then back to Dario. He wanted to leave, to escape the crushing sense of defeat that was slowly creeping over him, but he knew he couldn't. He couldn't just walk away, not from Dario, not from the life he had chosen, not from everything he had worked for. The world he had tried to control was slipping away from him, and he didn't know how to stop it. Dario's presence in the room was suffocating, yet oddly comforting, like a shadow that wrapped around Marco and refused to let go. He could feel the older man's gaze on him, could feel the weight of experience that Dario carried with him. Marco had always thought that the world worked in a linear fashion, that if you made the right moves, played the right cards, you could rise to the top. But Dario was telling him something different. The world wasn't linear. It was a web of intricate connections, and in this world, if you didn't understand the connections, you would become entangled in them, lost and alone. "You've made your choice, Marco," Dario said again, his voice still calm, but with an edge to it now, as though he were speaking to a child who had not yet learned the rules of the game. "You've chosen to fight for something you don't fully understand. You think you're ready, but you're not. You think you're stronger than you are. But I've seen this before. I've watched men just like you, young, hungry, ambitious, rush in, thinking they could conquer everything. And I've watched them fall." Marco swallowed hard, trying to hold on to some shred of defiance. But the truth was, Dario was right. He wasn't ready. He had rushed into this world without understanding it, without knowing the depth of what he was facing. And now, the consequences were closing in on him, tightening around him like a noose. He tried to steady his breath, to regain some semblance of control over the situation. "I can handle it," he muttered, more to himself than to Dario. "I'm not afraid. I can handle whatever comes my way." Dario didn't respond immediately. He simply watched Marco, his expression unreadable. The silence stretched between them, and for a moment, Marco thought he might not say anything at all. But then Dario spoke, his voice cutting through the tension like a knife. "You're not afraid, Marco. That's what you believe." Dario's tone was almost a whisper now, as if the words were meant to pierce straight through to Marco's core. "No, Marco. You're not afraid of the people who want to take you down. You're afraid of what you've already become." In the stillness that followed, Marco felt a shiver crawl up his spine. The weight of Dario's words hung in the air, thick and oppressive, like the calm before a storm. He wanted to speak, to argue, to deny, to lash out, but the truth had already begun to sink in. The path he had chosen, the ambitions that had once driven him, now seemed distant and blurry, like a dream fading with the morning light. He had fought so hard to reach the top, but now that he was here, he found that the view was not what he had expected. Dario, ever calm, watched him silently. There was no satisfaction in his eyes, no triumph. He wasn't gloating over Marco's uncertainty. If anything, there was a quiet sorrow in his gaze, an understanding that came only from years spent in the shadows of the world they inhabited. Dario had seen men like Marco before, young, ambitious, hungry for power, unaware of the consequences of their choices. And he had seen them fall. "Power isn't what you think it is," Dario said quietly, his voice breaking the silence between them. "It's not just about control, about crushing your enemies or making people fear you. Power is about knowing when to stop, when to step back and let things fall into place. It's about understanding the fragility of life, the transience of everything you're fighting for." Marco's gaze flickered toward Dario, his mind struggling to process the truth of what was being said. Dario's words didn't match the world he had imagined, the world where power was a prize to be fought for, to be earned by any means necessary. In Marco's vision, power was something solid, something real, something that would shield him from harm and protect him from those who sought to destroy him. But now, standing in front of Dario, he realized that power wasn't a fortress. It was a reflection, a fragile illusion that could shatter at any moment. He ran a hand through his hair, trying to steady his thoughts. Everything he had worked for, everything he had sacrificed, was beginning to feel like a hollow victory. The men he had once seen as his allies, the ones who had promised loyalty and support, were now turning on him one by one. His reputation, which he had built so carefully, was starting to fray at the edges. The fear that had once kept people in line was no longer enough. People weren't afraid of him anymore, they were just waiting for him to slip, waiting for his downfall. And Marco knew it was coming. He could feel it, like the slow rise of an inevitable wave, gathering strength just before it crashed down upon him. "You think you can hold on to this forever," Dario continued, his voice like a steady rhythm, a reminder of the harsh truth that Marco could no longer escape. "But there comes a time when it slips through your fingers, no matter how tightly you hold on. The game doesn't care about your intentions, your desires, your dreams. It only cares about who's standing when the dust settles." Marco felt his heart tighten in his chest. The realization was dawning on him. He had been so certain, so sure of himself. He had believed that if he played the game right, he could win, that power, respect, loyalty would follow. But now he saw the ugly truth of it: power was temporary, fleeting. And in the world they inhabited, where allegiances shifted like sand, it was only a matter of time before his own empire crumbled. "I thought I could do this," Marco said quietly, the words coming out more as a confession than a statement. "I thought I could be different. I thought I could be the one to change everything." Dario's gaze softened, though there was still a hint of sadness in his eyes. "We all think that, Marco. We all think we can change the world. But the truth is, the world doesn't change for anyone. You can't force it. You can't manipulate it to your will. You can only survive in it. You can only adapt, because the moment you stop adapting, the moment you stop being aware of how things are shifting, is the moment you lose." Marco swallowed hard, his throat dry. He had been so blinded by ambition that he hadn't seen the warning signs, hadn't understood that the world around him was constantly shifting, constantly evolving. His enemies were waiting for his weakness, for the moment when he would falter. And that moment had come. It was inevitable. "You still have a choice, Marco," Dario said, his voice softening further. "It's not too late to walk away. It's not too late to step out of the game. You can leave, find something else, something better. You don't have to stay here, drowning in this world of blood and betrayal." But Marco wasn't sure anymore. Part of him wanted to believe Dario, wanted to take the out that was being offered to him, to walk away from everything that had consumed him for so long. But another part of him, perhaps the stronger part, the part that had pushed him to climb higher, fight harder, didn't want to give up. Giving up would mean admitting defeat. It would mean walking away from everything he had fought for, everything he had sacrificed. And Marco wasn't sure he could do that. "Maybe I can't leave," Marco said, his voice tinged with a mix of bitterness and resignation. "Maybe I've already gone too far. Maybe there's no way out anymore." Dario's expression remained unchanged, but there was an understanding in his eyes now. He had seen it before, the internal struggle, the moment when a man realized that he was trapped in the web he had spun himself. It was a painful realization, one that left you empty and lost, unsure of who you were or what you had become. "You're not trapped," Dario said quietly. "But you have to decide what you want. Do you want to keep fighting, knowing that the end will come? Or do you want to let go, knowing that there's a chance for something else, something better?" The question hung in the air like a challenge, but also like an offer, a choice. And Marco, for the first time, wasn't sure what to do with it. His mind was a storm of thoughts, swirling in every direction, torn between the man he had been and the man he could still become. But the storm inside him was dying down, and the clarity that followed was a sobering one. In the end, Marco knew what he had to do. He had to face the consequences of his choices, face the fact that the power he had sought so desperately wasn't his to keep. He had fought and clawed his way to the top, but now, as he stood on the precipice, he realized that the fall would be far harder than the climb. "Maybe it's time," Marco said finally, his voice quieter now, almost a whisper. "Maybe it's time to let go."